So my aim in this talk is rather narrow, despite the breadth of the concept, which interestingly is deeply, though differently relevant to both political philosophy and literature. Before I get to the specific literary nexus that I want to explore, I need to state at the outset that this paper is not interested in dialogism as it has been theorized and elaborated in the works of Bakhtin. The theories of dialogism and heteroglossia in the novel are hugely important, but I'm actually interested, somewhat more mundanely, in some of the formal and conceptual properties of conversation marked as spoken in the novel. And in particular, I'm interested in occasions where such speech stands out as a moment where key ethical or political issues are at stake. To some degree, this means being interested in a form of argument between characters typically associated with the novel of ideas and the political novel. Ultimately, I want to use a certain understanding of character dialogue to consider the complexities of the relationship between thinking and speech in realist fiction, one focused in particular on understandings of and responses to injustice. This analysis of dialogue is related intimately to a project I've been doing on the moral and psychological dimensions of rumination, including literary forms of rumination. The extension of the topic to a consideration of the relation between thinking and action through speech involves, to some degree, extending the political implications of the project, which in some cases people have seen as too intra-subjective. But it also allows for the reconsideration of certain novelistic outliers, which fall outside of easy classification as political novels for reasons which I think stem from their more integrated treatment of rumination and speech. I'll define rumination a little bit later. I will treat one such example today, get ready, from the works of Anthony Trollope. But you don't need to know anything about Trollope in order to grasp the claims I will be making about him. And my hope, moreover, is that the claim is portable and will prompt reconsideration of other novels you may happen to know better. I mean, I don't know who here has read Phineas Finn. Any hands? All right. Yay, Emily. Okay, all right. In approaching this topic, I'm also aiming to make a plea for more nuance when assessing the ways in which certain conversations operate within the larger ethical and political context of the novel, especially when it belongs to or draws on the conventions of the novel of ideas. There's a tendency to label the novel of ideas, there's a tendency for the label novel of ideas to be something of a dismissal when applied, or at the very least, an assumption of a kind of artificiality or imposed structure, a gimmick, to adopt Sian Nai's recent discussion of the genre in her book, The Theory of the Gimmick. The novel of ideas thus becomes something of a bad object for the literary critic, who puts aesthetic value above anything so banal as cognitive content. The novel of ideas is seen as problematic because it seems to want to make transparent or manifest what should remain tacit or latent in any good work of art. The CFP for this conference participates in this attitude. When George Eliot articulated her aspiration in a letter to Frederick Harrison in 1866, quote, to make certain ideas thoroughly incarnate, as if they had revealed themselves to me first in the flesh and not in the spirit, she gives voice to the notion that ideas qua ideas are not proper art. And this viewpoint has been taken up in many discussions, not only of the novel of ideas, as it is commonly understood to originate in the late 19th century and into modernism, but also of its literary cousin, the political novel, which takes different forms across the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries. One common riposte at the first mention of the genre of the novel of ideas is to ask, how possibly could a novel not be about ideas? But it turns out that one of the central defining characteristics of the novel of ideas, and in fact the characteristic without which a novel generally is not considered, strictly speaking, to fall into the genre, is the appearance within the novel of a very specific sort of dialogue, which I have elsewhere referred to as character-character argument, rather than what we might think of as conventional dialogue. That's in Bleak Liberalism. I have a discussion of that. There are two crucial features to note about this type of dialogue, which cannot simply be viewed as regular dialogue advancing the action of the story world. First, the argument is embedded within and attached to formally elaborated characters, which inflects the way we understand its importance. This is especially important for those novels within the realist tradition and beyond that are deeply invested in the importance of character, both psychologically and morally. Secondly, these dialogues are actually a way of departing from standard narration by including forms of complexity that remain live and vital through the dramatic argument structure. As Nye points out, but to different ends, in these scenes of dramatic speech, the story time slows down to real speech time and thus introduces a competing generic element, drama, into the novel. Adapting key terms from narratology, Nye argues that in these moments, story and discourse become one and the same. I think that's debatable and raises further questions, but it's a useful provocation in thinking about the formal effect of these dialogic moments. Here's how Nye puts it within the context of an argument in which she is characterizing the novel of ideas as gimmicky and deficient relative to the innovative formal resources of the novel as a genre. Quote, in short, when the novel's dominant temporality becomes the real time of scene, as opposed to psychological stretch or historical summary, the novel is no longer in its technical wheelhouse, but that of another genre, i.e. drama. Indeed, stretch and summary are the only temporal modes in which an innovation entirely unique to the novel has been able to develop. She goes on, free indirect discourse in requiring the grammatical third person cannot take place at moments of direct speech by characters, nor can it take place in the direct speech by narrators, which gives rise to the pause in which discourse time is maximal and story time is null. That's narrator speech. Nye identifies three gimmicky techniques that are defined as anachronistic and in tension with the novel's innovative powers. Those three gimmicky techniques are allegory, narrator discourse, about ideas, and character debate. By contrast, what is seen as authentic about the novel is summary, free and direct discourse, and though she doesn't use the word, psychonarration, as defined by Dorrit Cohn. This is a modernism valorizing argument and ultimately a valorization of the representation of thought and the analysis of thought over the representation of speech. But what if we actually become a little more interested in the effects of character-character argument and the potentially productive relation between these scenes of dialogue and other features of the narrative? From another perspective, the shift into a dramatic mode functions as a kind of competing mode of telling, distinct from the narratorial voice, what the narratologist James Phelan, in a related treatment of dialogue, calls mediated telling. Such dialogues are not merely a clunky foregrounding of explicit ideas. It's an insistence that the ideas being presented need to be presented through embodied argument. The most commonly induced example of the kind of argument that marks the novel of ideas are the conversations in Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain between the characters Naphtha and Septembrini. But the type of examples I'm interested in here are typically memorable moments of confrontation and challenge across class lines or in protest of other forms of injustice. I have in mind here such moments as Mrs. Poyser's say out in George Eliot's Adam Bede, where a tenant challenges the squire and exposes his manipulative self-interest, or Margaret Schlegel's confrontation with Henry Wilcox in Howard's End, where she exposes his appalling double standard in judging her sister's sexual life while having conducted an affair during his own marriage. These types of speaking truth to power moments often have a kind of narrative autonomy that's hard to reabsorb, even if there are subsequent actions of repair. In their punctual and dramatic force, they often compete with the ostensible ending or closure of the novel. It's worth thinking about these moments as powerful political elements in the novel form. Typically, such heightened dramatic moments exist in some sort of relation to other formal or thematic investments. For example, as I argue in Bleak Liberalism, in Howard's End, there's a tension between the seductions of a kind of quiet communitarianism and the energy of vital confrontational debate on social issues. The fact that the novel's ending emphasizes a scene of quiet communing on the farm can lead one to overweight it in relation to the dialogic energy. Literature pedagogies at the level of primary and secondary school tend to reinforce the importance of closure in their schematization of conflict and resolution. And even at tertiary levels, there can be a tendency to privilege novelistic endings in the act of interpretation. But as I've said, there's value in pausing on the non-absorbability of certain speech acts, the fact that they cannot be retracted, or that their words hang in the air. In this way, they can perform the same function that certain unresolved endings do. What I want now to consider are the various ways that novelists place these types of conversation, and in particular, how they relate to certain forms of rumination. Let me first summarize the main lines of argument relating to rumination before I turn to the interplay of rumination and punctual action, such as confrontational or pivotal speech. The primary aim of my project on literary rumination is to isolate it as a form of thinking, fundamentally moral in nature, that many frameworks across the human sciences, including the methods of literary analysis, have failed to capture. Moral thinking, as it has been conceptualized, includes diverse forms such as deliberation, judgment, decision, and indecision. More emotionally laden forms include empathy and righteous indignation. Interestingly, some of the most influential frameworks for understanding human thought in psychology, in moral and political philosophy, and in cognitive science do not adequately account for the quality, form, and significance of those ruminative processes that follow in the wake of common experiences of moral shock or disturbance. Such experiences include, but are not limited to, forms of loss, grief, regret, or injury, including those fundamental assaults on dignity experienced as status injury. Insofar as they are defined in part by the moral shocks and disturbances that occasion them, ruminations involve attempting to come to terms with unsettling experiences and often involve acute ethical dilemmas about how to act given competing claims or internal ambivalence. In this sense, ruminations involve what we might call moral time, the slow time of processing profound experiences. My use of the term moral time, like my use of the term moral shock, is meant to underscore the close relation rumination bears to orienting values and commitments. The shock and the ruminative aftermath are typically the result of a perceived violation of those values and commitments. Overall, this project is aimed at defending and reframing rumination against its popular pathologization in contemporary cognitive behavioral psychology and psychiatry. What's powerful about the novel's method of representing these forms of thought is its ability to capture their recurrence, as well as the ways in which they can be non-teleological and yet somehow necessary to moments of punctual decision or processes of eventual acceptance, resignation, resistance, or action, including action through speech. In this sense, rumination must be contradistinguished from deliberation, that key processual form that has been used to attribute a living dynamic to the role of reason in politics and ethics. Rumination is not structured by sustained reflective awareness of the sort that we associate with deliberation. In addition to moving in and out of relative levels of reflective awareness, it often includes striking visual images or memories that seem to visit the mind unbidden. As I have suggested elsewhere, Anthony Trollope is in some ways the great novelist of rumination, capturing the recursive thought processes of characters who are working through ethical dilemmas or brooding over various forms of injured dignity. In the book Character, which Adi mentioned, which I collaborated on with Rita Felsky and Toril Moy, I offer a reading of rumination as it functions in the last chronicle of Barset, paying particular attention to the Reverend Crawley's sense of injured dignity and Lily Dale's sense of injured love. I also have a pretty long reading of Virginia Woolf, as it happens, in that chapter. As my final example today, I want to turn to one of the Palliser novels, Phineas Finn, to extend the discussion of rumination to a set of larger questions having to do with the political novel and the novel of ideas, and more specifically to the place of dialogue and debate in relation to the distinctively inner processes of ruminative thinking that I've been exploring in my current project. To begin with, it should be clarified that Phineas Finn does not quite fall under the rubric of the political novel, and this is true in general for the Palliser series. In Politics and the Novel, Irving Howe makes a distinction between the social and the political novel. The social novel, which in Howe is very close to what others would call the novel of manners, presupposes a stable society and presents it as such. He mentions Austen as an example. In a political novel, by contrast, the idea of, quote, the idea of society as distinct from the mere unquestioned workings of society has penetrated the consciousness of the characters in all of its profoundly problematic aspects. They now think in terms of supporting or opposing society as such. They rally to one or another embattled segment of society, and they do so in the name of and under prompting from an ideology. During the course of drawing out this distinction, Howe speaks disparagingly of Trollope as a case in which the social novel has, quote, declined into a sediment of conventional mediocrity. I think this fails to do justice to Trollope. I would argue that Phineas Finn is a social novel about politics, and as such, places certain ideas about politics and about the social forces affecting politics in the foreground while minimizing the actual political debates and struggles, which are about the Reform Bill, the secret ballot, and tenant right in Ireland. And they do function in the novel, but they are in the background to some degree. For example, we are told at one point that Phineas, who has entered Parliament, is enjoying, quote, that politico's social success which goes so far toward downright political success. And to the extent that we encounter dialogue about political matters, it tends to circle around certain informing, moral, and practical issues of political life, most centrally, whether one should vote according to principle or party. It's actually a profoundly timely book if you read it. I mean, it really reflects the current era amazingly. Another indicator that this novel does not fit the rubric of the 19th century political or social problem novel is the fact that it does not have the standard dual plot economy of the 19th century political novel, where the romance plot vies with the political plot, typically, according to standard ideological critique of the genre, so as to domesticate or displace the political plot, diffusing its energy and providing bourgeois comfort to its readers. In Phineas Finn, the romance plot does not compete with or displace the political plot. It is totally coterminous with it and itself markedly political. John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Women is alluded to twice, for example, in Conversations. This is one reason why the arguments about romance and women's arguments with men are so important, and I will return to this. What I want most to focus on here is the place of rumination relative to certain speech acts or dialogues that relate fundamentally to the object of the ruminative process. It's my premise that in Trollope, there's an almost intimate relation between certain ruminative experiences and the conversations that issue in their wake. This is also true to a certain degree with respect to another major form of moral reflection in this novel and across Trollope, and that is moral deliberation in the face of an existential choice. There's a specific claim I'm making about Trollope here that I don't have time to fully substantiate through comparative example, but relative to other 19th century novelists, such as Eliot and James, there is more of an expressive outlet for rumination and deliberation, an easier form of transit across what might seem to be private forms of reflection and public interaction. For the purposes of this reading, I want to focus on the character of Phineas, who serves as a Whig member of Parliament, and the woman to whom he first proposes, Lady Laura Standish, a socially influential woman who takes great interest in discussing the dynamics of parliamentary political life and participating in the social advancement of careers and interests. She takes a particular interest in Phineas. For her own part, she makes a consequential and fateful decision to marry an established and wealthy politician, Mr. Kennedy, with the idea that such an alliance will provide for her the greatest field of action for her ambitions. She ends up feeling entirely stifled in the marriage and deeply regrets the fact that she did not follow her heart and marry Phineas, who proposed to her directly after she had, unbeknownst to him, accepted Mr. Kennedy. To begin with Phineas, his ruminations reflect his acute anxiety about how he has appeared to others, hence anxieties about status, as well as forms of sorrow and regret in the face of loss. One key object of rumination is his failure to speak effectively, or in some cases to speak at all, in Parliament. He's tortured by this failure. At one point, he confides to his friend and ally, Mr. Monk. Mr. Monk responds sympathetically, and this leads only to more extended ruminations about his failure and the sense that he is fundamentally inauthentic, an imposter. His thinking at this moment is tied to the sense that he is a cheat, and that had he stayed in Ireland and married his early love, Mary Flood Jones, he would not have been a cheat. Interestingly, the novel yokes integrity and fidelity in the thought processes of Phineas. Violating either leads to forms of self-recrimination in which status anxiety gives way to a more fundamental experience of inauthenticity. Phineas also ruminates about his love life, particularly in the wake of a marriage proposal he makes to another character, Violet Effingham. After first proposing and not getting a positive answer, he travels to Ireland and thinks ceaselessly about the situation. Quote, he felt very keenly that his position was unsatisfactory and brooded over it all the autumn and early winter, but he could form no plan for improving it. Later, when Lady Standish informs him that Violet has accepted another offer, he experiences it as a great blow, after which follows a deferred rumination showing the powerful connection between an instigating shock and the long tail of rumination. As Trollope puts it, quote, a horse will gallop for some scores of yards after his back has been broken, before he knows of his great ruin. And so it was with Phineas Finn. As he becomes aware that his back is broken, he revolves over and over in his mind his own situation, his dashed hopes, his anger with the rival, his own lack of faithfulness to his earlier love for Lady Standish, once again veering toward the question of his own moral probity. But the key trope that continues through a long ruminative passage is that of the broken back and the awareness of it and its accompanying train of thought, despite continued conversations and activity. That train of thoughts includes dashed hopes, disavowal, renewed hopes, plans for perseverance, anger at the rival, suspicion of coercion, attempts to fortify himself, reminders of the injury. Perhaps one of the most striking aspects of Trollope's novelistic art is his insistence on the persistence of ruminative life, over and above what look like moments of punctual decision or conventional plot pivots or even plot endings. A powerful example of this feature of his writing takes place at the novel's conclusion, when Phineas makes the weighty decision to resign his position and return to Ireland to marry Mary Flood Jones. Quote, my reader will probably say that he was not a true man unless he could do this without a regret. When Phineas thought of it, there were many regrets. Although there are moments in which Phineas gives his ruminations an expressive outlet, when we turn to Lady Laura Standish, we see something a little different and more pronounced, what we might call a more direct inspiration provided to dialogue from the force of the rumination. When Phineas speaks, he's looking for relief and for some sort of consoling response, it would appear, or at least to disburden himself. By contrast, Lady Laura seems to have reached firm moral judgments, including about herself, as a direct result of her ruminations, and those come out in charged moments of what we might call moral argument. Lady Laura sees herself as having made a terrible choice in marrying Mr. Kennedy, and she also has the moral courage to admit that she injured him in doing so, even as she sees clearly his oppressive manner of treating her. As she says to Violet Effingham, quote, "I do not know that I have done much wrong to Mr. Kennedy since I married him, but in marrying him, I did him a grievous harm." This comes after repeated long sessions of thinking things over. I will quote one example from one Sunday on which Lady Laura pleads a headache and declines to accompany her husband to church. Lady Laura, when she was left alone, began to think of her position. She was not more than 4 or 5 months married, and she was becoming very tired of her life. Was it not also true that she was becoming tired of her husband? She had twice told Phineas Finn that of all men in the world, she esteemed Mr. Kennedy the most. She did not esteem him less now. She knew no point or particle in which he did not do his duty with accuracy. But no person can live happily with another, not even with a brother or a sister or a friend, simply upon esteem. All the virtues in the calendar, though they exist on each side, will not make a man and woman happy together unless there be sympathy. Lady Laura was beginning to find out that there was a lack of sympathy between herself and her husband. It's so deceptive, the simplicity of his writing. She thought of this till she was tired of thinking of it, and then, wishing to divert her mind, she took up the book that was lying nearest to her hand. It was a volume of a new novel which she had been reading on the previous day, and now, without much thought about it, she went on with her reading. There came to her, no doubt, some dim, half-formed idea that, as she was freed from going to church by the plea of a headache, she was also absolved by the same plea from other Sunday hindrances. Her husband forbids novel reading on Sunday. There are a number of interesting things about this passage, including that it seems to go in and out of free indirect discourse. What's striking is the moral fairness and the psychological integrity. She esteems her husband, but she's tired of him. She feels no sympathy. And then there's the thinking about the situation until she's tired of thinking of it, the natural need to divert herself from the unresolvability of the situation, which will visit her again in future ruminations. It's interesting as well that there's only a half-lit awareness of what is motivating her turn away from the rumination and the fact that she glides from ruminating to novel reading, which suggests in a way that the novel can serve as an escape that is also a familiar home for the ruminator. All of this reveals the fascinating way in which rumination moves in and out of heightened moral awareness. Eventually, as those who have read the series will know, but I guess nobody here except Emily, Lady Standish leaves her husband. Okay, I want to close with speculating on some of the implications of a heightened attention to the moral and psychological importance of rumination in its relation to action through speech. As I noted earlier, discussions of the novel of ideas and of the social problem and political novel have typically paid special attention to the role of dialogue, and in particular to political and ideological debate. I participate in this tendency in bleak liberalism, identifying the importance of what I there call character-character argument, as I said, to distinguish it from dialogue in general, and also discuss the experience of a lived relation to political life as an important feature of the genre. The powerful moral ideation within rumination and the dynamic between its intrasubjective quality and more overt action in speech invites us to think a bit more capaciously about the novel of ideas. To adapt Arendt, the life of the mind and the dialogue of the self with the self is critical to our understanding of the life of ideas in the novel. Of course, we're aware of this with respect to certain uses of interior monologue and stream of consciousness in the 20th century and beyond. But it's interesting to think about how rumination in particular, which is at once moral, psychological, and political, might expand the interpretive and formal categories with which we approach the formal economies of the novel more generally. Thank you.